The Zhou dynasty was the longest dynasty in Chinese history, lasting nearly 800 years until its fall in 256 BCE. It is traditionally divided into the Western Zhou, which ended in 771 BCE, and the Eastern Zhou, which is further subdivided into the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. Although all three phases were foundational to Chinese history, they often remain poorly understood because the narrative is largely fragmented, and it is easy to focus on individual famous events without grasping the underlying structure behind them. And so, in this video, we will focus on establishing mental frameworks for understanding the Western Zhou and the Spring and Autumn period. A following video will do the same for the Warring States period. The Western Zhou is so named because its capital at Fenghao, the predecessor of modern Xi'an, lay in the west, while the Eastern Zhou capital at Luoyi, modern-day Luoyang, lay to the east. The Zhou dynasty is often described as the height of Chinese feudalism, since in a system that broadly parallels medieval Europe, the Zhou kings stood at the top, with vassal lords ruling their own states beneath them. A useful way to think about the three phases of the Zhou dynasty is in terms of the balance of power between kings and vassals. During the Western Zhou, the kings still exercised strong authority over the feudal states. During the Spring and Autumn period, that authority had largely been lost, but the states continued to operate within the framework of the old hierarchy, at least in principle, and warfare was still constrained by a sense of preserving what remained of the traditional order. In the final phase, the Warring States period, even this residual respect disappeared as the states engaged in open competition and conquest, culminating in the state of Qin's unification of China in 221 BCE. Its ruler then proclaimed himself the first emperor, inaugurating an imperial tradition that would last until 1911. With this overview in mind, let us get started with our main narrative. The Zhou dynasty was preceded by the Shang dynasty, which ruled much of the middle to lower Yellow River basin from around 1600 to 1046 BCE. At the time, the lower Yellow River followed a very different course, creating only a narrow stretch of land between the mountains and its vast marshy delta that was well suited to early large-scale agriculture. The Shang dynasty was centered here and expanded aggressively in all directions. To the east and south, they moved into the fertile Huai River basin, while to the west and northwest they pushed into the more remote mountainous regions. They imposed harsh obligations on those they conquered, including ritual human sacrifice, all of which eventually bred deep resentment against their rule. One of these peoples was the Zhou, who had likely migrated from deeper in northwestern China into the valley of the Wei River, a tributary of the Yellow River. Under King Wen, the Zhou developed into a strong regional state with many allies, and under his successor, King Wu, the Zhou and their allies launched an attack against the Shang. Although the Shang were far larger, wealthier, and militarily superior, the Zhou still prevailed in a dramatic upset, annihilating the Shang army and capturing its capital, bringing the Shang dynasty to a sudden end. King Wu of Zhou and his successors, Kings Chen and Kang, found themselves ruling over a realm that far outsized the Zhou homeland, with discontented locals agitating for rebellion. To govern these vast territories, the Zhou kings retained direct control over their core homeland in the Wei River Valley, later known as the Guanzhong Basin, centered on their capital at Fenghao. This region was called Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, a name that would become synonymous with China itself. Immediately east of the Wei River Valley lay a narrow mountain corridor leading into the North China Plain. At its eastern end, along the Luo River, a small tributary of the Yellow River, the Zhou established the city of Luoyi, also known as Chengzhou. The region around Luoyi was attached to Zhongguo and marked the far eastern limit of the Zhou king's direct authority. Outside of Zhongguo, in the newly conquered eastern territories, the Zhou kings appointed nobles to rule their respective states as vassals. In effect, the Zhou were a small conquering and colonizing elite, ruling a much larger and culturally distinct population. The most important early figure in the formation of the Zhou feudal system was Zhou Gong. The title Gong, for most of Chinese history, is a formal noble title translated into English as duke, although it is also more generally used as an honorific for a respected person. In English sources, Zhou Gong is still routinely referred to as the Duke of Zhou, even though calling him duke is technically incorrect, and his title should be more appropriately translated into English as the Lord of Zhou. Zhou Gong was the younger brother of King Wu, who died shortly after the destruction of the Shang dynasty, and served as the regent for the young king Chen. Zhou Gong is considered one of the foundational figures in all of Chinese history because he was traditionally accredited with formalizing the Zhou Li, that is, the Zhou rituals, the entire laws, customs, and government structure of the Zhou dynasty, thus allowing it to become more than just a temporary occupying force in the East. Modern archaeology and scholarship, however, suggest that many of the developments later attributed solely to Zhou Gong were in reality implemented gradually over multiple generations. This is not surprising, as it is common in traditional historiography to credit broad, long-term changes to a single emblematic figure. Central to the Zhou rituals was a strict social hierarchy. At the top stood the king, beneath him his direct vassals, the Zhuhou, and below them their own vassals, who still enjoyed special status above the common people. The Zhou kings claimed for themselves the mandate of heaven, the belief that heaven had entrusted them with the right to rule as long as they governed virtuously. The Zhou system relied heavily on blood ties. Political authority was frequently inherited through familial lineages, and what we might call meritocracy today was largely alien to this worldview. Within the family unit itself, a natural order was assumed: parents over children, men over women, and elder sons over younger ones, with primogeniture as the ideal form of inheritance. Superimposed on all of this was a body of ritual practices, many centered on ancestor worship, along with ceremonial music and the Zhou language, the root of Old Chinese. The Zhou emphasis on bloodlines and ancestor worship meant that keeping accurate records of the past was essential. Otherwise, after a few generations, few would remember who was who or who had done what. With literacy still in its infancy and oral tradition unreliable across generations, one way to cope with the limits of memory was the practice of assigning posthumous names. These were usually single-character names given to elites after death to sum up their lives. For example, King Wen. Wen, meaning cultured or scholarly, is among the highest praise, typically reserved for rulers seen as capable and benevolent. His son, King Wu, the martial king, was the conqueror of the Shang dynasty. The idea was that even if later generations remembered little else, the posthumous name alone would suggest the overall character of a ruler's reign. And just as there were good posthumous names, there were also bad ones. In much the same way modern politicians might worry about their legacies, Zhou rulers might be deeply anxious about their posthumous names, because after a few generations, those single characters might be all the general population remembered about them. One of the main ways the Zhou recorded major events was through bronze inscriptions. It is largely thanks to the excavation of many such bronzes in recent decades that our picture of the Western Zhou has become more complete than the idealized version in traditional historiography. These inscriptions are often only a few sentences long, and so had to be extremely information-dense. Posthumous names fit perfectly into this record-keeping logic. In addition to bronze inscriptions, Zhou scribes also kept records on wooden and bamboo strips, which would remain the primary medium of Chinese record-keeping until they were gradually phased out by paper in the early medieval period. The Zhou, perhaps because of their origins in an inland river valley, placed a premium on settled agriculture, which they considered superior to other livelihoods such as herding or commerce. The idealized fundamental unit of Zhou agricultural life was the well-field system, a group of 9 households farming a land unit laid out like a tic-tac-toe grid, resembling the Chinese character for well, in which 8 households work the outer plots for themselves and the central plot collectively for their feudal lord. The reigns of kings Chen and Kang are traditionally considered one of the great golden ages in Chinese history, an idyllic past in which Zhou rituals were observed across the realm, allowing elites and commoners alike to live in harmony within a perfect social order. If this sounds awfully like Confucianism, that is because the philosophy, at its core, involves a highly educated teacher, Confucius, living centuries after Zhou Gong, teaching his students about an idealized past and trying to reshape the society of his own time in its image. As a result, Zhou Gong is often regarded as the original Confucian sage, especially since he ultimately chose to return power to his nephew rather than seize the throne for himself. The Zhou dynasty regarded the peoples beyond Zhongguo and its vassal states as outsiders, grouping them under broad names based on the cardinal directions. To the east were the Yi, whose territory stretched from the Shandong Peninsula southward into the Huai River basin. Many Yi groups practiced settled agriculture and had prosperous commerce, and in the early Zhou period, pressure from the Yi was among the dynasty's main concerns. To the south were the Man, encompassing the indigenous peoples along the Yangtze basin and beyond. Man was likely the most culturally diverse of the four, with many modern groups in southern China and Southeast Asia likely descended from them, especially since Chinese dynasties over the millennia have consistently encroached on their lands to push them further and further south. To the west were the Rong, many of whom were nomadic or semi-nomadic, and the Zhou may have been closely related to them. And to the north were the Di, who, contrary to the usual image of peoples from beyond the northern frontier, were generally not nomadic, but rather practiced semi-settled agriculture across the mountains of North China. Collectively, these peoples were known as the Four Yi and distinguished from the Zhou, who saw themselves as the civilized center. The term is often rendered in English as the Four Barbarians, although Zhou relations with these groups were complex and fluid and did not map neatly onto the Western idea of barbarian. But as English has no precise equivalent, the word barbarian is still frequently used. According to traditional accounts, the Zhou established 71 initial feudal states after their conquest of the Shang, although only a small number of them would become historically significant. In the former Shang heartland were the states of Wei and Song. The character for Wei is normally romanized as Wei, but to distinguish it from the later and far more famous state written with a different character, it is often given the non-standard spelling Wei. Centered on the old Shang capital, Wei was founded by a younger brother of King Wu. Song, by contrast, was granted to a member of the Shang royal house allied to the Zhou and was established in a region traditionally regarded as the original Shang homeland. Together, Wei and Song formed the Zhou carrot-and-stick approach toward the Shang people. Wei imposed direct Zhou rule at the old Shang center of power, while Song offered Shang loyalists a familiar ruling house within the new political order. In the far east lay the states of Qi and Lu, founded as Zhou forward bases against the Yi peoples. Qi occupied a remote, marshy coastal frontier between the Tai Mountains and the sea, bearing the brunt of Yi pressure from the Shandong Peninsula. It was granted to Jiang Shang, also known as Jiang Ziya, a key general in the Zhou conquest of the Shang, who would later be deified in Chinese folk religion. Unlike most Zhou states, Qi's ruling house came from an allied but culturally non-Zhou background. Lu, by contrast, was the fief of Zhou Gong himself, although it was governed by his son in his stead. It lay in the fertile and well-protected valley of the Si River, a tributary of the Huai River, and enjoyed special ritual privileges. From its founding, Lu embodied orthodox Zhou values and pursued aggressive cultural assimilation of its population, eventually becoming a bastion of ritual conservatism. Little wonder that it was the home state of Confucius. Qi, shaped by its exposed frontier position and mixed origins, developed a far more pragmatic political culture, with an early emphasis on accommodating local customs and promoting commerce. Two additional states along the fertile Huai River tributaries were Chen and Cai, both founded by members of the Zhou royal house. Though neither became major powers, together with Song and Lu, they anchored Zhou influence in the Huai River basin. To the north lay Yan and Jin, which anchored the Zhou northern frontier. Yan, near modern Beijing, was a remote outpost founded by a member of the royal family to guard a key corridor against northern peoples, and was largely isolated from events farther south. Jin, founded by a younger brother of King Cheng, occupied the secluded valley of the Fen River, another major tributary of the Yellow River, placing it in close contact with numerous Rong and Di tribes. Finally, tradition also placed the founding of Wu in the distant Yangtze River Delta in this early era, attributing it to the elder uncles of King Wen, who supposedly abdicated their claims to the throne so that their younger, more virtuous relatives could rule instead. This makes for a classic Confucian morality tale, but it is likely not true. Archaeological evidence suggests that Wu was established generations later by a side branch of the Zhou royal lineage. After the initial wave of enfeoffment, new states continued to be created over the following centuries, and at their peak there may have been more than 1,000 states in total, even if most were tiny. The key feature of being a state was that they were direct vassals of the Zhou king rather than indirectly through other states. Even the larger Western Zhou states, such as Wei and Song, functioned less like territorial kingdoms and more like node-based political entities. Their authority centered on a capital and its immediate surroundings, while wide stretches of land between states remained sparsely settled or inhabited by peoples beyond Zhou control. In times of crisis, some states even relocated their capitals when local conditions became untenable. After the death of King Kang in the early 900s BCE, the Zhou dynasty entered a long, gradual decline. For much of the century, it faced growing trouble in the south, especially in the marshy and sparsely populated Yangtze basin. The region was rich in resources, above all copper, and in the Bronze Age, copper was a big deal. One southern people who threatened Zhou authority were the Chu, who, despite being vassals of the Zhou kings, were frequently rebellious. Around 960 BCE, King Zhao, the fifth Zhou king, personally led an army against Chu and its allies, only to suffer catastrophic losses. On his way home, he drowned while crossing the Han River, the longest tributary of the Yangtze. By the 800s BCE, the power of the Zhou kings had declined even further. Traditional Chinese historiography likes to frame this as a loss of moral authority, but in reality, they were facing mounting structural challenges. Externally, waves of Rong and Di migrations were pushing southward, possibly influenced by cooling global climates around this time, putting heavy pressure on Zhongguo and northern states like Jin. Internally, the balance of power was shifting toward the vassal states. Their lands and resources expanded as they became entrenched in the fertile eastern plains, while the royal domain, finite to begin with, gradually shrank as the kings continued to carve out fiefs for their supporters. Two more noteworthy feudal states emerged during this time. One was Qin. Its origins are disputed. Its ancestors were either migrants from the far northwest into Zhongguo or eastern peoples resettled on Zhongguo's western fringe to serve as buffers. The early Qin leaders rendered valuable service to the Zhou kings and were eventually granted a fief, establishing the state of Qin on the remote western edge of Zhongguo around 860 BCE. The other was Zheng, founded in 806 BCE by a younger brother of the second-to-last Western Zhou king and located in the very heart of Zhongguo itself. The Western Zhou dynasty continued to face mounting external pressure, and in 771 BCE, its capital at Fenghao was captured by the Rong, who killed the last Western Zhou king. Later tradition turned this collapse into a morality tale centered on the king's favorite concubine. To amuse her, he lit the capital's warning beacons, summoning his vassals in vain, and when real danger came, they no longer cared to answer his call. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, if only because such beacon systems likely did not exist until centuries later. After the fall of Fenghao, two pretenders to the throne emerged, and one, backed by Jin and Zheng, moved east to Luoyi in 770 BCE to establish a new court there, inaugurating the Eastern Zhou dynasty. Zheng also abandoned its territory and relocated eastward, founding a new capital at Xinzheng, that is, New Zheng, on the central plains not far from Luoyi. The next period of Chinese history, from 770 to 722 BCE, must have been 5 of the most consequential decades in all of Chinese history, although we know next to nothing about it because so few records survive. Still, from the situation in 722 BCE, we can infer a few things about what must have happened. First, by 722 BCE, Zhongguo had been reduced to a rump state, ruling directly over only Luoyi and its vicinities, and the Zhou kings had effectively lost their authority over the feudal states. This erosion of power was likely gradual, marked by political intrigue, challenges to hierarchy, and deep socioeconomic turmoil, compounded by continued warfare in the Yue River Valley that made any return west impossible. We simply do not have the details. The second process was that, as the Zhou kings lost their authority, many states began to absorb their neighbors aggressively. Here too, the record is thin. We rarely know the names of the conquered states, how these annexations unfolded, or what became of their rulers, although many were likely folded into the new ruling elites. What we do know is that by the time the record resumes in 722 BCE, of the estimated more than 1,000 states that had likely existed during the Western Zhou Dynasty, only about 100 remained. Powers such as Jin, Zheng, Qi, Lu, and Chu had grown into territorial states, dominating their respective regions. The third process was a political upheaval in Jin, known as Chu replacing Yi, which serves as a representative case for similar struggles likely unfolding across the Zhou world. In 745 BCE, the ruler of Jin granted his uncle the city of Chu, larger and more prosperous than the Jin capital at Yi. Over the next several generations, the Chu branch repeatedly rebelled against the Yi branch, until the Zhou king finally recognized the Chu line as Jin's ruling house by 678 BCE. This subversion violated traditional Zhou ideals, and the fact that the Zhou king ultimately sanctioned it was a clear sign that the old social order was falling apart. The ancient record resumes in 722, the first year covered by the Spring and Autumn Annals, the text that gives this period its name. The Annals record events from 722 to 481 BCE, a span of 242 years. The Spring and Autumn period, strictly speaking, corresponds only to these years, although modern historians usually extend its beginning back to 770 to avoid an awkward gap following the fall of the Western Zhou Dynasty. Tradition attributes the Annals to Confucius, even though it was more likely the official state chronicle of Lu, the home state of Confucius, which he may have simply edited and recompiled. The title Spring and Autumn itself may have been a generic term for a state's annual records, and the text is written from the perspective of Lu. It is a remarkably short work, only about 17,000 characters long, and to illustrate its style, we should walk through its entry for 722, the first year of the rule of Lord Yin of Lu, line by line. The first year, spring, the royal first month. The third month, our lord and Zhu Yifu swore a covenant at Mian. Summer, the fifth month, the Earl of Zheng overcame Duan at Yan. Autumn, the seventh month, the heaven-appointed king sent his steward, Xuan, to us to present the funeral equipment for Lord Hui and Zhongzi. The ninth month, we swore a covenant with a Song leader at Su. Winter, the 12th month, the Zhai Earl came, Gongzi Yishi died. As you can see, these entries offer almost no detail. They are simply a record of major events, mostly of matters such as treaties and diplomatic visits, important to note, but of limited help in understanding the deeper political dynamics of the period. But one line clearly stands out. The Earl of Zheng overcame Duan at Yan, or in Chinese, 郑伯克段于燕. This phrase is strange for several reasons. Although the king's vassals, zhuhou, held distinct ranks, in this case bo, usually translated as earl, the convention of the annals is to respectfully refer to deceased zhuhou as gong, or lord. Yet the ruler of Zheng is called by his actual title, bo, rather than gong. Even more striking is the verb ke, to overcome. In the rigid hierarchy of Zhou politics, ke normally implies defeating an opponent of equal rank, but Duan could not have been the Earl of Zheng's equal, otherwise that would have been explicitly stated. So what is going on? The interpretation in traditional Chinese historiography is that Confucius disapproved of the Earl of Zheng's actions and deliberately diminished him through this wording. Yet from these 6 characters alone, we still have no way of knowing what actually happened. Fortunately, another text, the Zhuan, does tell us what happened. The earl in question was Lord Zhuang of Zheng, although the title Lord in this context is generally translated into English as Duke. So to minimize confusion, we will call him Duke Zhuang of Zheng. He ruled Zheng from 743 to 701. He was born breech, and his mother resented him for it, favoring his younger brother Duan, and even urging the ruler of Zheng to make Duan the heir. When Duke Zhuang later came to power, she secured Duan a large fief, which he gradually turned into a power base that threatened Duke Zhuang's authority. An advisor warned that Duan, backed by his mother, was like creeping vines that would be harder to uproot the longer they were allowed to grow. But Duke Zhuang refused to act, justifying his inaction with a phrase that later became an idiom. 多行不义必自毙. Those who commit many unjust acts will bring about their own destruction. As signs of Duan's insubordination mounted, the warnings intensified, but Duke Zhuang still held back. Eventually, Duan openly prepared an attack on the Zheng capital, with their mother planning to open the city gates for him. When Duke Zhuang learned of the plot, he moved decisively, sending an army to seize Duan's stronghold. Duan was forced to flee, first to Yan, and then into exile from Zheng. The Zhuan closes this episode with a comment on the Annals phrasing, "The Earl of Zheng overcame Duan at Yan." It explains that Duan is not called a younger brother because, by his conduct, he had ceased to behave like one. The conflict is framed as if two rulers were at war, which is why the character Ke is used. At the same time, Duke Zhuang is referred to only as the Earl of Zheng to criticize him as well, because he failed to properly guide his brother and instead allowed his offenses to grow until he had justification to strike. Duke Zhuang reappears in later passages of the Zhuan as an increasingly disruptive figure. Although he, like the rulers of Zheng before him, served as a minister to the Zhou king, he openly challenged royal authority, even forcing the king to exchange hostages with Zheng. In 707, a Zhou-led coalition attacked Zheng but was defeated, and even the king was injured by an arrow. Although Duke Zhuang was capable and ambitious, his conduct was precisely the type that later Confucian tradition viewed with deep disapproval. The terse style of the Spring and Autumn Annals, which often requires the Zhuan to explain, is traditionally described as expressing 微言大义, lofty principles through subtle words. Although this phrase was coined by later followers rather than Confucius himself, it captures how the text came to be interpreted. This approach gave rise to what became known as the Spring and Autumn style of writing. The flexibility of Chinese grammar, both classical and modern, makes this kind of indirect communication especially powerful, encouraging readers and listeners to look for significance not only in explicit claims, but also in word choice, sentence structures, and omissions. The Zhuan is a parallel work to the Spring and Autumn Annals. It begins in the same year, 722 BCE, but continues to 468 BCE, 13 years beyond the end of the Annals. Tradition attributes it to Zuo Qiuming, a student of Confucius who sought to preserve the master's correct teachings. As Confucius left no written evaluations of historical figures, and interpretations began to diverge soon after his death. Unlike the terse Annals, the Zhuan is roughly 10 times longer, and without it, the Annals would be nearly incomprehensible. Zuo Qiuming was said to have been blind, a familiar trope of the blind seer who truly sees. In reality, Zuo Qiuming was likely a pseudonym, and research suggests that the Zhuan contains multiple layers, some close to the events they describe, others added generations or even centuries later. The Zhuan originally circulated as a text separate from the Spring and Autumn Annals. Many events recorded in the Annals do not appear in the Zhuan, while the Zhuan in turn preserves events absent from the Annals. The form in which we read today was largely standardized in the 200s CE by the scholar general Du Yu, who played a key role in the conquest of the Eastern Zhou Dynasty that ended the Three Kingdoms period, and who was also an ancestor of the Tang Dynasty poets Du Fu and Du Mu. Du Yu edited the text and added his own commentaries, superseding earlier layers of interpretation. He also interleaved the Annals with the Zhuan, so that each entry in the Annals is immediately followed by its narrative explanation. This merged format is the version that we read today. The Zhuan is not the only commentary on the Annals. Two others, the Gongyang Zhuan and the Guliang Zhuan, also survive, but they focus primarily on unpacking the subtle moral meanings embedded in the Annals wording. While the Zuo Zhuan also engages in moral interpretation, it does so far less systematically, devoting most of its attention instead to the historical narrative. To this end, the Zuo Zhuan is intensely narrative-driven, written in a terse, elegant, and often action-packed style. Rather than offering direct analyses of historical motives, it relies heavily on dialogues and speeches, allowing its characters to state their views in their own words. It has long been regarded as a literary masterpiece and a foundational work in the development of Chinese prose. Many of its episodes are among the most famous stories in Chinese culture, and even those pesky idioms that Chinese learners need to know, hundreds of them are pulled directly from this text. Many of the events recorded in the Zuo Zhuan have no independent corroborating sources, and even after many centuries of exhaustive analysis, there are simply limits to what scholarship can definitively establish. Accepting its core narrative as the likely thread of events ultimately requires a certain leap of faith. After all, the history of this period is fragmented, the narrative discontinuous, and events are filtered through carefully chosen wording to convey Confucian moral judgments. Learning the Spring and Autumn period therefore inevitably involves both historical reconstruction and literary analysis. In a sense, this is unavoidable, since early historical writing often blurs the modern boundary between history and literature. In the West, for example, also despite centuries of scholarship, our understanding of the Persian Wars remains deeply shaped by Herodotus, with his emphasis on heroic grandeur, hubris, and freedom versus despotism, culminating in dramatic confrontations such as Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, while our picture of the Peloponnesian War is inseparable from Thucydides' rational reflections on realpolitik and long speeches probing the motives of political actors. Had the roles of Herodotus and Thucydides been reversed, our memory of these two wars will look very different. With this groundwork in place, we can now turn to the main events of the Spring and Autumn period. In the final decades of the 700s BCE, Zheng, under the leadership of Duke Zhuang, was highly active in interstate politics, aided by its proximity to the Zhou royal house and its position in the heart of the Central Plains, the large, flat central region between the Yellow and Huai rivers, linking more rugged peripheral zones to one another. But this same location also left Zheng hemmed in by rivals on all sides with little room to expand, and after Duke Zhuang's death in 701 BCE, its political influence quickly waned. Nearby Wei, another leading Zhou state, followed a similar, albeit even more dramatic, path. Its rapid decline was traditionally explained as a critical breakdown of Zhou values, leading to intra-family feud, usurpations, assassinations, and civil wars. But in more practical terms, the decline of Wei likely owed just as much to geography, as it lay directly along the southward migration routes of various Di groups. In the state of Qi, Duke Huan took power in 685 BCE and appointed Guanzhong as his chancellor. Guanzhong quickly reformed the administration and promoted trade, most notably by exploiting Qi's coastal resources in fish and salt, generating immense wealth. But Qi's rise was still not immediate. In 684 BCE, Duke Huan invaded neighboring Lu, which, despite its prestige, had been weakened by internal strife and widely regarded as no match for Qi. At the Battle of Changshao, the Qi army sounded its drums to signal the attack, but the Lu forces deliberately held back. Only after Qi had beaten its drums multiple times did Lu finally attack, routing its much stronger opponent. Because, as the commonly used idiom drawn from this battle puts it, 一鼓作气, morale is highest on the first drumbeat, so Lu waited for Qi to exhaust itself before striking. At this point, it is worth pausing to outline how warfare functioned during the Spring and Autumn period, when conflict between states tended to be highly formalized and centered on chariot warfare. The nobility were expected to answer their lord's call to arms, and much like the knights of medieval Europe, they supplied their own equipment and retainers. Each chariot was typically crewed by 3 men, a driver, an archer, and a third fighter, often the noble himself, armed with a long polearm. The defining weapon of this era was the ge, usually translated as dagger axe, designed to allow its wielder to slash or hook sideways as enemy chariots rode past. As the Spring and Autumn world gave way to the Warring States period, chariots gradually lost ground to massed infantry formations, which emphasized forward-facing combat rather than lateral strikes. This shift favored the ji, a hybrid of spear and dagger axe, often translated into English as halberd. From the Warring States period into early medieval China, the ji became the dominant battlefield polearm, until the rise of cavalry and heavier armor made its hooked blade unwieldy, leading to its replacement by simpler spears and pikes. A simple way states measured their mobilizing power was by how many chariots they could field. In the early Spring and Autumn period, a few hundred war chariots constituted a major army. As the great states expanded, these figures also climbed. By the height of the Warring States period around 300 BCE, when chariot warfare had largely fallen out of favor, military strength was still commonly expressed in chariot units, with the largest states claiming forces on the order of 10,000 chariots. Back to our main narrative. Setting aside the defeat at Changshao, Qi turned its attention to building an interstate coalition. Setting aside the defeat at Changshao, Qi turned its attention to building an interstate coalition, eventually winning the support of states such as Lu, Song, and Zheng. At the same time, Di incursions from the north intensified, culminating in the destruction of Wei in 660 BCE. The fall of Wei became one of the strangest morality tales in Chinese historiography. Its duke was said to have indulged in an obsessive love of cranes, the bird, raising large flocks, lavishing them with titles, and neglecting his duties. When the Di attacked the Wei capital, his subjects refused to fight for him, remarking that the birds should do so instead. The Di obliterated Wei and killed the duke, leaving behind only some 5,000 survivors. In the aftermath, Duke Huan of Qi successfully led a coalition to defeat the Di and re-establish Wei, although the rebuilt Wei was just a shadow of its former self. Duke Huan's coalition also came into conflict with the southern state of Chu. Like Qi, Chu had benefited from a peripheral position that gave it room to expand, but unlike most northern states, it had little connection to the Zhou royal house, which freed it to expand in an especially aggressive manner. The rulers of Chu went as far as declaring themselves kings, placing themselves, at least in theory, on equal footing with the Zhou kings, even if this claim carried little weight in the north. As Chu repeatedly pressed into the Central Plains, several subjugated states appealed to Qi for protection. In 656 BCE, Duke Huan led a coalition that defeated Cai, an ally of Chu, and then confronted Chu directly, eventually negotiating a peace agreement with Chu. Then, in 651 BCE, Duke Huan convened another interstate conference attended by states such as Lu, Song, Zheng, and Wei, and even the Zhou king sent envoys. The assembled states pledged mutual non-aggression, collective defense against external threats, and continued recognition of the Zhou king's authority. Duke Huan was naturally acknowledged as the hegemon in the alliance. Centuries later, historians retrospectively identify the 5 hegemons of the Spring and Autumn period. There are different lists, although Duke Huan is a unanimous pick. While Qi enjoyed its prestige as the first among states, Jin was also growing more powerful as it expanded aggressively into Rong and Di territories. Yet its tradition of internal turmoil persisted. The ruler of Jin took a new wife who sought to displace the existing heir in favor of her own son. The eldest son was killed, and the second, Chong-er, fled the state, spending 19 years from 655 to 636 BCE as a political refugee, first among the Di peoples and then in various Zhuhou states. In Qi, Guanzhong died in 645, followed soon after by Duke Huan in 643 BCE. Duke Huan's death triggered immediate infighting, effectively ending Qi's interstate leadership, and much of Qi's history over the following century remains obscure. After Duke Huan's death, one of his sons fled Qi, and Duke Xiang of Song quickly intervened militarily to install him as the new ruler of Qi. Over the following years, Duke Xiang leveraged this success to assert himself more forcefully in interstate affairs and to claim the vacant hegemonic role, especially since Song already enjoyed exceptional prestige as a descendant of the Shang dynasty royal line. Duke Xiang is also counted among the 5 hegemons, although not unanimously. His ambitions soon brought him into conflict with Chu, and in 638 BCE, the Chu army marched into the Central Plains and met Song at the Battle of Hong. As the Chu forces began crossing the Hong River, Duke Xiang's advisor urged an attack mid-crossing, but Duke Xiang refused on ritual grounds. The much larger Chu army crossed unopposed, formed up, and routed the Song forces. Duke Xiang died the following year from wounds sustained in the battle. His refusal to strike the Chu army mid-crossing has become one of the most famous Chinese cautionary tales against rigid adherence to outdated rules. Yet, it is worth remembering that Song's authority rested largely on its role as a guardian of the traditional order. Had it been the first to abandon ritual restraint, it might have found it difficult to demand continued respect from others. The year after Chu's victory at Hong, Chong'er also arrived at Chu to seek refuge, and during a feast, the king of Chu casually asked Chong'er how he might one day repay his hospitality. The king was likely just fishing for compliments, but Chong'er took the question very seriously and awkwardly answered that if Jin and Chu were to go to war, he would voluntarily withdraw his army by a distance of 3 she, roughly 30 kilometers, as a gesture of respect. Chong'er was not welcomed in Chu and quickly fled west to Qin, then under the rule of Duke Mu. Over the centuries since the Zhou court's relocation to the east, Qin had steadily filled the power vacuum in the Wei River Valley, expanding primarily against the Rong and Di peoples. Duke Mu took a strong personal interest in Chong'er and sealed a marriage alliance with him, giving rise to the idiom Qin Jin Zhi Hao, the good relations between Qin and Jin, which later came to mean a strong marriage alliance in general. With the military backing of Duke Mu of Qin, Chong'er finally took power in Jin in 636 BCE, receiving the posthumous name Duke Wen. Since the posthumous name Wen, cultured, is not given to just anybody, we can tell from this name alone that his rule was successful. Duke Wen quickly reformed Jin's government and military, relying heavily on talented aristocrats from outside of the Jin ruling family. In 633 BCE, Chu again pushed into the Central Plains, this time against Song, which appealed to Jin for aid. Duke Wen of Jin led his army south to intervene. The following year, as the Chu forces advanced northward into Wei territory, Duke Wen deliberately withdrew his army by the promised 3 she, ostensibly to honor the pledge he had once made to Chu, but also luring the Chu army into less favorable terrain. At the Battle of Chengpu, the Jin army, fielding some 700 war chariots and supported by allies from Song, Qin, and Qi, decisively defeated the Chu forces and their allies from Chen and Cai. That winter, Duke Wen convened a conference to which even the Zhou king was summoned, a breach of etiquette that nonetheless reflected the extent of his power. He thus became another of the 5 hegemons, and, like Duke Huan of Qi, a unanimous choice. As Jin came to dominate the Central Plains, its ally Qin also looked eastward, although expansion in that direction was constrained by the treacherous route through the Xiao Mountains. In 630 BCE, the combined forces of Qin and Jin laid siege to the Zheng capital. In one of the most famous episodes of the Zhuan, the Zheng envoy Zhu Zhiwu was lowered by rope from the walls of Xinzheng under the cover of night to meet privately with Duke Mu of Qin. He argued that because Jin lay far closer to Zheng than Qin, its conquest would only strengthen Jin at Qin's expense. A more powerful Jin, he warned, would eventually threaten Qin, especially since Jin had already broken past promises. But if Qin spared Zheng, it could gain a valuable ally in the east that controlled key roads. Persuaded, Duke Mu withdrew his army. Jin was subsequently forced to lift the siege, and Zheng survived at the expense of the alliance between Qin and Jin. Duke Wen of of Jin died in 628 BCE after a brief 8-year reign. Soon afterward, Qin again moved against Zheng, this time launching a unilateral long-distance surprise expedition. The plan was discovered, the element of surprise lost, and the Qin army was forced to turn back. But as it passed through the Xiao Mountains, it was ambushed by Jin forces and annihilated. Qin suffered several further defeats at Jin's hands before finally securing a victory in 624 BCE, symbolically avenging the disaster at Xiao. By the time Duke Mu of Qin died in 621 BCE, his achievements were substantial enough that he, too, was counted among the 5 hegemons, albeit not unanimously. In the 2 centuries after Duke Mu's death, Jin continued to block Qin's eastward expansion, forcing Qin to largely abandon its ambitions in the Central Plains, and its history during this period is comparatively obscure. The once close relationship between Qin and Jin was also dead, and Qin increasingly cooperated with Chu as a counterweight to Jin. For the 2 decades after the Battle of Chengpu, Jin and Chu largely avoided direct conflict and were content to dominate their respective spheres, Jin over Zheng, Song, Wei, and Lu, and Chu over Chen and Cai. In 613 BCE, King Zhuang of Chu came to the throne. For several years he appeared indifferent to governance, indulging himself while powerful nobles ran the state. As his subjects grew increasingly uneasy, an advisor went to him with a riddle. There is a bird that for 3 years has not flown and has not sung. What kind of bird is this? The king replied, "It might not have flown for 3 years, but when it flies, it will soar to the heavens. It might not have sung for 3 years, but when it sings, it will shock all who hear it." Soon afterwards, King Zhuang moved decisively to crush his enemies, consolidated power, and enacted reforms that rapidly strengthened Chu. King Zhuang began to lead a revitalized Chu on northern expeditions. He led his army to the outskirts of the Zhou capital, prompting the Zhou king to send an envoy. Under the Zhou dynasty, royal authority was symbolized by the 9 Ding, sacred bronze ritual cauldrons. In a pointed provocation, King Zhuang questioned the envoy about the 9 Ding, their size and weight. The envoy replied that political legitimacy came from virtue, not force, and King Zhuang let the matter drop. From this episode comes the idiom 问鼎中原, to ask about the Ding in the Central Plains, meaning to contend openly for rule over China, a question that countless figures in later centuries would seek to answer. Over the next decade, King Zhuang continued his campaigns into the Central Plains, and in 597 crushed the Jin army at the Battle of Bi. By the time King Zhuang died in 591 BCE, Chu had eclipsed Jin as the dominant power in China, earning King Zhuang a place among the 5 hegemons. But in the decades after King Zhuang's death, Jin regained the upper hand, defeating Chu at the Battle of Yanling in 575 and winning a series of further engagements. Both sides eventually grew exhausted by decades of warfare and concluded a treaty in 546. The treaty was signed in Song, which often functioned as an intermediary between the two, and was witnessed by most of the major states. It recognized Jin and Chu as co-dominant powers. Jin's allies, such as Zheng and Lu, were required to pay tribute to Chu, while Chu's allies, including Chen and Cai, did the same to Jin. Qi, aligned with Jin, and Qin, aligned with Chu, were exempt. We can think of this arrangement as an explicit recognition of the 4 great powers during the spring and autumn period. Jin and Chu as the primary powers, and Qi and Qin as the secondary powers. The treaty finally brought to an end the nearly 90 years of warfare between Jin and Chu, the rivalry that formed the spine of the spring and autumn period. By the end of the wars between Jin and Chu, Zhou China had changed dramatically from the early spring and autumn period. Within many states, the authority of the Zhuhou rulers was weakening. Much like the earlier decline of the Zhou royal house, the Zhuhou themselves presided over layers of powerful noble families who gradually expanded their land holdings and challenged their lord's authority. The clearest example was Jin. Scarred by generations of intra-family conflict, Jin's rulers had deliberately avoided empowering their own relatives, instead relying on unrelated noble lineages. Over time, these families came to dominate Jin's politics, and by the late 500s BCE, Jin's rulers had been reduced largely to figureheads, with real power resting in the hands of 6 great families. At the same time, the peripheral states continued to expand outward. In the west, Qin absorbed large numbers of Rong peoples. In the north, Jin pushed into Rong and Di lands. In the east, Qi expanded across the Shandong Peninsula, while Chu absorbed Yi groups in the Huai River basin. And in the south, Chu spread across much of the Yangtze basin to become a superstate. These conquests blurred the old distinction between Zhou states and outsiders, as conquerors absorbed the customs of their new subjects. Meanwhile, literacy increased, agriculture and commerce expanded, states shifted toward direct taxation and corvée labor, fabulously wealthy merchants appeared for the first time, and coinage began to circulate. To manage these changes, governments grew more complex and increasingly relied on a broader class of military and civilian elites, prompting many states to turn to reformers to remain competitive in an increasingly unstable political world. One of the most important statesmen of the late Spring and Autumn period was Chen, a member of the Zheng ruling family who served as the chief minister of Zheng for over 20 years until his death in 522 BCE. Situated between Jin and Chu, Zheng had long survived through careful diplomacy, and Chen preserved its independence by skillfully navigating relations with both superpowers. At home, he carried out wide-ranging reforms, including compiling and publicly displaying the first known written law code in Chinese history, casting it in bronze to centralize legal authority and curb arbitrary noble power. He struck a careful balance between reform and tradition, becoming an early Chinese figure to set standards for centralized, merit-based governance, even as official positions remained embedded within an aristocratic framework. Another prominent statesman of this period was Yan Ying, more commonly known as Yanzi, with Zi being an honorific meaning master. He served as a high-ranking minister in Qi for over 4 decades, most notably under Duke Jing of Qi. He was famous for his sharp wit in diplomacy. On one mission to Chu, his hosts tried to insult him for his short stature by constructing a small side gate for him to enter. Yan Ying replied that if he were visiting a dog state, he would gladly use the dog gate. But since he was visiting Chu, he would enter through the proper one. Later, the king of Chu asked Yan Ying why he was chosen as the envoy. Couldn't Qi have sent someone better? Yan Ying answered that Qi chose its envoys to match their destinations, and since he was the least capable, he had been sent to Chu. At home, Yan Ying served during a period when Qi's ruling house was steadily losing authority to powerful noble families. Highly pragmatic, he worked to check aristocratic power, upholding tradition or pursuing reform as circumstances demanded. One story emblematic of his governing style is the tale of killing 3 warriors with 2 peaches. Duke Jing had 3 formidable warriors in his service, but they grew arrogant and became difficult to control. Yan Ying convinced Duke Jing they had become a danger to the state, yet they were too powerful to arrest or assassinate. His solution was to send 2 peaches as a reward from Duke Jing, telling the 3 men to divide them according to who had contributed the most. 2 immediately claimed a peach for themselves. The third, left with nothing, angrily protested that he had done even more for Duke Jing than the other 2. The first 2 warriors grew ashamed of their greed and took their own lives. Seeing this, the third warrior said his pride had caused his friends' deaths and also killed himself. Duke Jing then buried all 3 with full honors. This story was heavily retold in later generations, becoming a symbol of expedient statecraft and the moral cost of political necessity, an unsettling contrast to the Confucian ideal of rule grounded in authentic virtue. As politics across China shifted throughout the Spring and Autumn period, the state of Lu continued its slow slide into political irrelevance. Rather than innovate, its elites clung ever more tightly to their prestige within the old Zhou ritual order, devoting themselves to the preservation of traditional symbols such as music and dance. Paradoxically, this may have offered a measure of protection. Lu was too weak to resist a major invasion anyway, but any stronger state that threatened it still had to consider the optics of violating a recognized center of ritual authority. At the same time, as diplomacy and administration grew more complex, people from across China increasingly traveled to Lu to study the practices that gave structure to elite political culture. It was in this environment that Confucius emerged. Confucius was born in 551 in Lu to a family of common gentlemen, positioned between the nobility and the commoners. His father died shortly after his birth, and Confucius was raised in relative poverty by his mother. He showed a precocious interest in Zhou ritual and learning from a young age, but his low social standing limited his early prospects, and as a young adult, he held modest posts such as granary keeper and district officer for a powerful aristocratic family in Lu. Confucius nonetheless pursued learning relentlessly and eventually mastered the 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, chariot driving, writing, and mathematics, the core skill set expected of political and military elites of his time. By his early 30s, as his reputation for learning and competence grew, he began attracting students and gradually transitioned into teaching. According to later tradition, he eventually taught some 3,000 students, of whom 72 were especially accomplished. Although Confucius is now remembered as a philosopher, no one can attract 3,000 students while charging tuition by running philosophical seminars alone, not in ancient times and not today. At its core, Confucius's school was a place for career training where he taught the 6 arts to prepare students for jobs that actually paid the bills. Confucius, fundamentally, was a deeply knowledgeable man who was very good at explaining things. But alongside this practical training, he modeled a way of life, and that is the main reason he is remembered today. At its core, Confucius's philosophy centers on individual moral cultivation through education and on people fulfilling their roles within society. In this sense, Confucius looked back to Zhou and his ritual system as a model of personal virtue, restraint, and social order, in contrast to the moral decay he was witnessing in his own time, even if archaeology suggests that much of what was later attributed to Zhou had been shaped by myth-making. Confucian thought emphasizes lived experience, how people relate to one another, how society functions, and how one governs well in practice. This approach naturally produces tensions, as expressed in later interpretations of the famous quote from Confucius, 君君, Chen Chen, 父父, 子子. Literally, sovereign sovereign, subject subject, father father, son son. Because classical Chinese lacks many grammatical markers used in modern communication, this phrase supports 2 common later interpretations. One emphasizes responsibility. The sovereign should act as a sovereign should, and the father should act as a father should. Under this reading, authority becomes conditional. If rulers or parents fail in their roles, their subjects or children may not be obligated to follow. The other interpretation emphasizes hierarchy. First comes the sovereign, then the subject. First comes the father, then the son. Their roles are defined by rank and authority. Both interpretations coexist in practice, with their application shaped by context, circumstance, and judgment. Even if we could press Confucius himself on which interpretation was correct, he might well answer that both are, depending on the situation. In 517 BCE, civil war broke out in Lu, and its ruler fled into exile in Qi. Confucius followed him and entered the service of a Qi noble as a retainer and advisor, using the opportunity to continue his studies and expand his network. During this period, Confucius gained audiences with Duke Jing of Qi, who was impressed by his learning and considered offering him a government post. But Confucius failed to win the support of Duke Jing's chief minister, Yan Ying, and the appointment never materialized. He eventually returned to Lu, where he resumed teaching. In his early 50s, as his reputation continued to grow, Confucius was again appointed to government office in Lu, eventually rising to the post of Minister of Justice. For a brief period, he implemented reforms that strengthened state authority and curbed elite abuses, but as his agenda clashed with entrenched aristocratic interests, he resigned in 497 and began 14 years of political wandering, traveling from court to court accompanied by several of his students. During these years, he was frequently driven out and, on several occasions, narrowly escaped assassination or starvation. Later generations tend to frame these travels in 2 different ways: as a virtuous sage ignored by a corrupt world, or as an out-of-touch moralist lecturing indifferent rulers. In practice, Confucius was seeking office as an administrator, and his problem was ultimately one of fit. Confucius advocated long-term state building through education, moral cultivation, and gradual legitimacy, while rulers were often focused on immediate needs. A modern analogy would be a celebrated CEO candidate who keeps getting interviews, but whose pitch centers on long-term cultural reform while the board is looking for short-term results. The incentives simply did not align. In 484 BCE, the nearly 70-year-old Confucius finally returned to Lu, where he was received as an honored elder but given no political authority. He spent his final years teaching and compiling ancient texts, especially the Spring and Autumn Annals, and died in 479 BCE. His given name was Kongqiu, but he is commonly known as Master Kong, Kongzi, or Kongfuzi, from which the Latinized name Confucius is derived. He did not record his teachings himself. Instead, his students later compiled his sayings into what became the Annals of Confucius. Over the centuries after his death, followers expanded and systematized his ideas, until Confucianism became the orthodox state ideology nearly 400 years later, playing a central role in Chinese political and intellectual life for the rest of the imperial era. The death of Confucius effectively marks the close of the Spring and Autumn period, since the period, after all, takes its name from the chronicle traditionally attributed to him. There are, however, a final set of major events unfolding in the southeast during the latter half of Confucius's life. Although these events were largely separate from developments in the Central Plains, they are perhaps the most famous episodes of the entire Spring and Autumn period and deserve to be told in full. In 522, in the state of Chu, a noble named Wu Yun, more commonly remembered by his courtesy name as Wu Zixu, was driven into exile after his father, a high-ranking official, was falsely accused of treason and executed. He eventually reached the distant southeastern state of Wu, where he entered the service of Prince Guang, the king's nephew. With Wu Zixu's help, Prince Guang plotted to seize the throne. In 515, he invited the king to a feast, where an assassin named Zhuan Zhu approached the king carrying a fish. Zhuan Zhu drew a hidden dagger from the belly of the fish and stabbed the king, killing him instantly. Zhuan Zhu was immediately cut down by the guards. Prince Guang subsequently declared himself king, becoming known in history as King Helü of Wu. Under King Helü, and with Wu Zixu as a key advisor, Wu transformed into a major military power. King Helü also drew on the expertise of Sun Wu, better known as Sun Zi, the author of The Art of War, who is said to have trained and advised the Wu army. In 506, the Wu army, led by Wu Zixu and Sun Zi, invaded Chu, eventually capturing its capital. The king of Chu, who had ordered the execution of Wu Zixu's father years earlier, was already dead, so Wu Zixu exhumed his grave and whipped the corpse. Soon after, however, Chu's old ally Qin intervened, forcing Wu to withdraw and allowing Chu to be restored. Nonetheless, Wu's success was such that King Helü became a non-unanimous hegemon in some sources. After returning from the Chu campaign, King Helü turned south toward the state of Yue. The people of Yue were an indigenous southern group whose customs differed sharply from those of Wu and the Central Plains. Ancient sources mention that they cut their hair short, tattooed their bodies, and spoke a language unintelligible with both the Zhou language in the north and the southern language of Chu. In 496, Wu invaded Yue. In the ensuing battle, King Goujian of Yue sent forward waves of soldiers sworn to die. These soldiers advanced on the Wu ranks, shouted, and then killed themselves by slitting their own necks. As the Wu soldiers stood frozen, King Gojian ordered a counterattack that routed the Wu army. King Helü was struck by an arrow and died soon afterward. On his deathbed, he told his son Fuchai to never forget revenge. King Fuchai spent the next few years rebuilding Wu. As Wu grew stronger, King Goujian grew anxious and, against the advice of his counselor Fan Li, launched a preemptive attack. He was defeated and retreated to Yue territory with 5,000 men for a last stand. At Fan Li's urging, King Goujian sent another advisor, Wen Zhong, to sue for peace. Fuchai wavered, but Wu Zixu pressed him to finish off Yue, and the talks collapsed. Undeterred, King Goujian sent Wen Zhong again, this time with bribes for Bo Pi, another one of Wu's key ministers. Bo Pi took the gifts and persuaded King Fuchai to accept a treaty. In later accounts, almost certainly fictional, King Goujian is said to have been taken to Wu, where he spent years abasing himself before King Fuchai until he grew complacent and allowed Goujian to return home. More likely, Goujian remained in Yue, but as a humiliated vassal of Wu. Now, it was his turn to swear revenge. To harden his resolve, he slept on firewood and regularly tasted the bitterness of a gallbladder, reminding himself of his humiliation. This act became a famous Chinese idiom, 卧薪尝胆. Goujian lived simply, wearing plain cloths, avoiding meat, working the fields himself, while his wife wove cloth. As part of his effort to keep King Fuchai complacent, Goujian sent a beautiful woman from Yue, Xi, to the Wu court as a concubine. Like many stories surrounding the Wu-Yue conflict, her existence is almost certainly a later invention, yet it became so famous that Xi entered tradition as one of the 4 great beauties of Chinese history, an honor defined largely by literary impact rather than historical description. In these stories, Xi is so beautiful that fish who see her stop swimming and sink, while geese who see her stop flying and fall from the sky. In Wu, Fuchai becomes fully enamored with Xi and gradually neglects his duties as king. In reality, King Fuchai remained highly ambitious, perhaps too much so. He turned his attention north and eventually prepared to invade Qi. Wu Zixu warned him that Yue, quietly recovering under Goujian, posed the greater threat. Fuchai ignored the advice and went on to defeat Qi in a major campaign. Wu Zixu continued to press Fuchai about the danger of Yue, angering the king, while the minister Bo Pi slandered him at court. In 484, Fuchai finally ordered Wu Zixu to take his own life. As he prepared to die, Wu Zixu bitterly asked that his eyes be hung on the eastern gate of the Wu capital, so they could one day witness the entry of the triumphant Yue army. Fuchai pressed his ambition north and, in 482, convened a conference with other states to contest hegemon status with Jin, earning enough prestige to later be counted by some among the 5 hegemons. While he was away, Yue launched a surprise attack on Wu, defeating it before withdrawing. Yue struck again in 475. Weakened by years of Fuchai's northern campaigns, Wu's capital finally fell in 473. Fuchai fled to the nearby mountains and, echoing Goujian years earlier, sent a messenger to sue for submission. Goujian also hesitated, but Fan Li warned him not to repeat the mistake Fuchai had once made. Goujian pressed on. He offered Fuchai a small fief if he surrendered, but Fuchai chose to take his own life instead, covering his face so that he would not have to meet Wu Zixu in the afterlife. After conquering Wu, Goujian dispensed rewards and punishments. He granted Fuchai a proper burial, but executed Bo Pi for his treachery despite his role in Wu's downfall. Goujian then turned outward, leading an expedition north of the Huai River and convening a conference with the rulers of Jin and Qi. He sent tribute to the Zhou king, who in return bestowed him with sacrificial meat and the title of Earl. Goujian used his influence to reorganize much of the lower Yangtze and Huai River basins, eventually relocating his capital as far north as Langya, near the border with Qi. By the time of his death in 464 BCE, he was successful enough that some later sources list him as among the 5 hegemons. Not long after the fall of Wu in 473, Fan Li left Goujian's service. He later wrote to Goujian's other trusted advisor, Wenzhong, "When the birds are gone, the bowl is put away. When the rabbits are dead, the dogs are cooked. King Goujian is a man with whom you can share hardship, but not success. You should leave him." Wenzhong did not listen. Soon afterward, Wenzhong was accused of treason, and Goujian sent him a sword with a message. "You once gave me 7 stratagems to use against Wu, but I needed only 3. For the remaining 4, go practice them with my ancestors." Wenzhong took his own life. As for Fan Li, later stories say that after the fall of the Wu capital, he finds Xi and flees north with her. He eventually becomes a wealthy merchant, living out his days in peace at her side.